Good morning. It's good to see each and every one of you that chose to be with us this morning. This is the auditorium class for the adults, and I'm glad that each and every one of you are here. Several of you are visiting with us this morning. Thank you. We're glad you're here. We hope you know while you're here that you're wanted and made to feel welcome and edified as we worship together. We've been studying in the auditorium class the book of John for the last several weeks, not looking at it like a commentary, going verse by verse, but really looking at the unique nature of John and some of the themes or some of the scenes that are unique to the book. For instance, we talked about the 7 I am statements of Jesus. We talked about the 7 miracles that are highlighted by John. 5 of the 7 are unique to John. And then we began talking about some of the encounters, some of the scenes that John records that we won't find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. For instance, the occasion where Nicodemus came to Jesus by night in John chapter 3, or the Samaritan woman of chapter 4. And then most recently, we looked at washing the disciples' feet. This scene that we're probably, I assume, all of us are pretty familiar with. It's unique to John, as are several of the things that we find in the upper room, or the final evening of Jesus' life before his arrest. And so we are privy to this scene that is about service and certainly very applicable. So last week, as the bell caught us, we talked about this scene again that I'm just going to review, although I'm confident we're familiar with it, where we find Jesus after the supper girding himself and washing the disciples' feet. He rose up to serve, we're told in verse 4 and 5. Verses we'll look at again here in just a moment. And we noted last week Peter's reaction to this. Peter was reluctant to accept Jesus putting himself in a subservient position, in a position that was, inferior in the mind of Peter and others. The act of washing the feet of someone that came to your home was a duty that was often relegated to the servant of the house. But yet here was Jesus, who was the teacher, who they'd come to understand and accept and believe and confess was the Son of God, the Christ, the Messiah. They understood who he was. And he was stooping, literally, and in this hierarchy of worth, to do this deed that was demeaning in their estimation for someone of Jesus' authority, position. And so Peter's reluctancy was based upon that obvious observation. You're not going to wash my feet. I should be washing your feet, basically. But then we find Jesus convincing him. And then the betrayer of Judas is mentioned, and we talked a little bit about Jesus' willingness to wash the feet even of his betrayer. And then we're told at the end of this section that this was done to be an example for us. And Jesus basically said, if I am who you believe and confess me to be, and you appreciate that, but yet I'm still willing to do the dirty work, if you will, to lower myself, to humble myself by choice, to be in the role of a servant, which in most people's estimation was nowhere they wanted to be. Jesus had made that point several occasions before. For instance, you might think of the question that he posed to his disciples on one occasion, where he said, and I paraphrase loosely, which is a greater position to be in? The one who sits at the table and is served, or the one that's serving the table? Which is the best position? Which is the desirable position? Well, to be the one sitting at the table. And I've often jokingly said, if you go to Cracker Barrel, would you rather sit down and make your order and eat your food and have your glass refilled? Or would you rather be the one that has to fetch the food and wash the dishes? Well, I'd rather be the one that just kind of sits there and orders people around to give me what I want. I want more tea. I want more of this. And Jesus said, that's right. That's the most desired position. Then he said, yet I am one among you who serves. I didn't have to. But I chose to put myself, I voluntarily put myself in the role of a servant. Why did I do that? as an example for you to go and do likewise. Powerful, powerful. He didn't just ask people to adopt a philosophy, but he demonstrated that philosophy. And so we talked about that last week, and that's where we ended, and there's your review. Now, I mentioned last time that this is an important subject that we could spend a little bit more time on. So that's what we'll do now, and talk about this idea of service for just another couple of minutes. What are some basic principles of service that we learn from this familiar scene? Well, number one, you're likely going to have to lay something aside in order to serve. If we go back to the scene, and I mentioned we'd read it again, look at verse 4. Note verse 4. He rose from the supper and laid aside his garments. Now, in this, very literally, he had to lay something aside so that he could do the task. But I'm thinking this principle. What is it we might have to lay aside for us to serve other people? Well, maybe our ego. Maybe our pride. Listen to how practical this is. Maybe our time. Maybe we lay aside what we'd like to do and think about the interest of someone else. Yeah, I'd rather maybe be home relaxing with my family, sitting in my easy chair watching a ball game, but I'm going to lay that aside so that I could go serve in some capacity that's warranted or needed, or I have an opportunity to do good, or something is needing to be done. There's some urgent need in the body that I can address. What am I going to have to lay aside? Maybe a ball game, maybe time, maybe money. Think about the Good Samaritan. Well, for him to get involved and to serve someone else, what did he have to lay aside? His plans, maybe where he was headed, maybe the comfort of him riding on his beast, some money, some time, right? We also see another principle, that you have to prepare to serve. If we look again at verse 4, look again at verse 4. So he rose from the supper, he laid aside his garment, he took a towel and girded himself. He had to prepare himself by getting his garments prepared for him to stoop down. He had to get the towel. He had to do a few preparatory things to be in the place to serve. How might we have to prepare? Well, maybe if I'm going to serve in some capacity, like going to restore a brother who's overtaken in sin or teach someone the gospel, maybe I need to prepare by studying myself to show myself approved. Then I need to make that preparation before I go. In other words, I don't need to go headlong into correcting a brother if I haven't taken the time to do some diligent study on my own and prepared for that process. We have to prepare to know how to answer. All right? What are some other ways we might have to prepare to serve? Well, maybe it's, again, this notion of mindset, priority. Am I willing to lay some things aside? What type of training might I need? Or what type of... I'll tell you, for instance, I remember years ago, long before there were cell phones, and I look around the room, with the exception of maybe a few, most of you remember before there were cell phones. One of the things I used to like to do, and I just liked to do it, it wasn't required of me, but I lived in Nashville at the time, and living in Nashville, I lived in a community about 40 minutes away, and I had to drive in and make a commute to Nashville, back and forth. Again, before cell phones, or at least before they were popular, and before I had one. I mean, I guess you had them old brick ones, but anyway, what I would do is I would find people that broke down on the side of the road, and I would pull over and help them. I don't do that near as much anymore, but I used to do that relatively frequently. So what I would do is I went and bought a whole thing of Fix-A-Flat. You could buy them by the case. I bought a few extra donuts, you know those donuts that you put on a car. And I just bought a few things like that, and I kept them in my trunk. So when I saw somebody broke down, I was prepared I could help them. I was also prepared with my card that I would give to them. It was a business card. And it had, directed them to me, and I'd say, I'd love to sit down and study the Bible with you. Now, what's interesting is, if you stop, pull over, and help somebody fix a flat tire, then give them a card, you got a pretty decent chance of maybe setting up a study. So there was some preparation. There's an example. You can probably think of your own. All right, so what are some other basic principles? You may have to get your hands dirty. A lot of the service that we might do in the course of helping each other, because in the context, Jesus says you ought to wash one another's feet. This wasn't go into all the world and wash people's feet, right? This was wash one another's feet, basically. And no, not literally, but the idea is that you serve one another in love, like Paul wrote to the Galatians. So as we think about this, get your hands dirty, what does it look like to serve other people? Well, I think it's maybe as often as anything, I've helped people move. A lot of times people just need help moving. Moving's expensive and, heavy, and it takes several people, and it takes a lot of time. You got to sweat. Maybe you have to help people in other various areas that aren't dirty physically, but help them fix their finances, help them with their marriage, help them if they get caught in some kind of issue because they've been overtaken in a trespass. I can remember not long ago, well, it's been a while now, counseling people who had made a mess of their finances because of a gambling addiction. Well, I had to get my hands dirty and go in there and help them with their finances. Not literally. I didn't have to literally go sweat or dig a ditch or those type things, but you have to get involved. And it might be messy. It might require some sacrifice. All right, let me pause at this point. I've been doing all the talking. Questions, comments, thoughts so far? Was that a cricket? All right, let's look at some other principles. Maybe they'll warrant some discussion. When you are willing to serve and you are going to lay things aside, put yourself in the position to serve other people, you will likely face some criticism. There was the point here in verse 8 where there was some criticism of Jesus' initial attempts by Peter. We alluded to it. He said, "You aren't going to wash my feet. You're not doing that. It'll never work. That's a waste of time. No, In the episode that's highlighted on the screen in Mark 14, there's the occasion where the woman broke the alabaster flask with spikenard oil as she anointed the feet of Jesus. You remember she was criticized, right? She was criticized sharply because she had wasted the money. It's 300 denarii. That could be used to facilitate some other ministry for the poor, and you have done some other service, and it was a waste. You shouldn't be spinning your wheels doing that. We could have done something else with that time, energy, effort, and money. What did Jesus say? She's done a good work. She's done what she could. This is what she had to offer. She was willing to give. She was willing to sacrifice. She was willing to set something aside. She made this preparation, and she did. Criticism often comes in the form of kind of this same attitude. It's a waste. I remember one time helping someone and then being criticized because that person drove a particular type of car, or they had a cell phone, or they got their nails done, and so you shouldn't be helping them with some other type of financial need. Well, this criticism can come in a variety of forms, but oftentimes that's not a good idea. That's a waste. You shouldn't do that. Usually from people that oftentimes aren't doing much of nothing. Were Judas Iscariot's motives for criticizing her, virtuous? No. So you'll face criticism. Well, we're going to start a ministry and help the homeless. Well, why are you wasting your time with that? Oh, we're going to go do this. Nah, it's a waste. Well, I guess we could just do nothing. All right. Does that generate comment, question, discussion, thoughts? Sure.
And, it's like, I don't think about that. I let God handle that. I don't do it. I don't worry about the sacrifice we might be making.
Sure.
And, that's just what it makes me think about.
In my observation, I think the only way to avoid criticism for doing something is not do anything. That's the only way you avoid criticism. This is Jesus doing something and facing criticism, and this isn't an isolated incident. It's merely a sample of the fact that people criticized Jesus for doing the right thing, or criticized other people for doing a virtuous right thing. Kenny?
That's not right, Joe. If you don't do anything at all, somebody will call you lazy.
That's true, yeah. Yeah, but the only way to avoid criticism in the realm of serving is to not serve. But yeah, I guess you're right. Then they would criticize that you don't do nothing. So, yes, I guess the point is apropos. There's nothing you can do to avoid criticism. The other principle, or one of the other principles that I thought was worth mentioning is you'll serve those who don't appreciate it. I mean, right? Because the point that we made last week and that we all know is that he washed Judas's feet too. Even though he knew that Judas was not only unreceptive to being a faithful disciple, but on the other end of the spectrum, he was even willing to turn Jesus over for a price. But he didn't go eeny, meeny, miny, mo and say, I'm serving this one, I'm skipping Judas. I mean, no. He was willing to serve those who didn't appreciate it. One of the points that I think everybody's pointed out before is that the volume of people that came to Jesus to receive either food or healing or some other sort of physical need addressed, the sheer volume. I mean, it said times a whole city came out to be healed. But the whole city was not making any type of spiritual reform or willingness to repent, for the kingdom of God is at hand, or to receive that Jesus was the Messiah they'd been looking for. Presumably, some of them weren't even looking for a Messiah. They were looking for a free meal. They were looking for healing or help or, some type of physical burden relieved. And so Jesus did that. And he knew it was a percentage game. There were only a percentage of them who would springboard from that physical need to receiving Jesus' spiritual offer of not, water to drink, but of living water. Not of food to eat that perishes, but that bread that comes from heaven. So, do we ever have a reluctancy to serve? I think we do. And I think some of these same principles help circumvent that tendency to excuse myself from service because, hey, look, I don't want to make these sacrifices, get my hands dirty, do this. When I'll face criticism and a percentage of people who are unreceptive to, anything beyond what seemingly is taking advantage of my time, money, energy, resources, or my efforts to bear their burdens. Right?
You become like that unprofitable servant who took the talents and hid them.
Yeah. We've talked about that a number of times where, he took the talent, what he had, and in Matthew chapter 25 and verse 15 said each one was giving according to his own ability. So he had the ability to do something. And he could have at least, we're told, deposited in the bank so there'd be some interest drawn at bare minimum. But instead of that, he hid that. And the Bible says that he responded by saying, I did that because I was afraid. What was he afraid of? Well, let me tell you one thing I know that happened in that scene. There was a comparison. It seems like there was 3 tiers, right? There was the one that had 1 talent, and the one that had 2, and so forth. And it seems like what they did with that was examined in front of the others. So we knew there was going to be some level of accountability, scrutiny. Maybe I'll be judged on how successful I was, and that gives me trepidation. I don't want to be judged and scrutinized about what I did with that. And so I don't want to ever be criticized for wasting it. Imagine this, and I've said this before, but imagine this scene. Imagine this working out different, and the one talent man decided, I'll start a business. I'll do what he said. I'll buy and sell and hopefully make a profit, and I'll be able to give back more, and that'll be the right thing to do. And he goes out and he starts a business. And the trade's unsuccessful. And he ventures out and he tries to buy and sell and make a profit, only to buy and sell and lose some. And again, this is hypothetical. This is speculative. But what would the master say to that? I believe, and this is just me, and I'm speculating, and I know the text doesn't say this, but presumably under this hypothetical scenario where he goes out and he tries and he fails, I believe, in my opinion, he'd have said, well done, thy good and faithful servant. Was it about being able to double the money? Or was it about taking the opportunities you have and going out and striving to be fruitful with them? Is it just a success-oriented parable? Or is it about being faithful? Is it about doing the best you can with what you got where you are? Independent of whatever the results are not up to you necessarily. Yes, ma'am.
So what do you do if you know, referencing John 13:10, you know they're ungrateful, you know they're just taking advantage of you. What do? Do you still do it if you have the means to do it? Because you know how come you do it.
Well, sure. Well, obviously we have to use discretion and discernment, and we have the responsibility to be good stewards. And I'm not saying that you enable people. I'm not saying that you allow yourself to be perpetually taken advantage of by the same people. No, I'm not advocating for that. But I'm also not advocating for excusing ourselves. I guess it's like a spectrum, right? Well, I'm not going to help because people are, taking advantage of me. And the other end of the spectrum is, I'm helping everybody that's taking advantage of me. Well, no, I think that we have to appreciate that there's a percentage of people whose needs are disingenuous. And all we're really doing is, enabling. And when we get to that point and make that discernment, then I think that we have every duty and responsibility to quit enabling. Does that make sense? All right. Final principle that I wanted to point out, and again, these are just a few observations that I think are practical from this very familiar scene. Look at verse 12. So when he had washed their feet, taken his garments, and sat down again, then he said this to them. The point that I make from this is when he had finished the work, then he reclined, then he relaxed. It's kind of like this reminder that we have that ultimately we have the hope to rest from our sitting in a pew. No, to rest from our labors, right? It's the idea that, we teach this principle to our children. Okay, so if there's some chore, obligation, responsibility, get your work done first, then you can play. Our children are homeschooled or virtual schooled, and what we do is say, hey, look, get your schoolwork done, get the handful of chores you're obligated to do done, then you can play. Then you can go do what you want to do on your tablet or play your video game, etc. It's a simple principle. Do the work, then rest. So these are just a handful of practical principles from that familiar scene. Any final comments about that before we make a pretty, broad transition to another topic? Kenny?
As I read verses 4 and 5, I can see in it an outline of Christ's entire life and mission, purpose on earth in those two verses. It says he rises from supper and laid aside his garments. Well, we know that Christ was in heaven, in glory.
Sure.
He laid that aside to come to earth. And then it says he took a towel and girded himself. When he left heaven, he came to earth and became flesh.
Mm-hmm.
God girded himself in human flesh. That was the towel. Verse 5 says, after that he poured water into a basin. I can see in that coinciding with he lived a perfect life. And he poured into his disciples, his apostles, the truth of the gospel. And he gave us baptism in that process to wash away our sins. It says that he began to wash his disciples' feet. And then it says, and to wipe them with the towel wherewith he was girded. Now, I just said earlier, the towel was his human flesh. He finished the job of washing their feet with the towel with which he was finished the job of cleansing us from our sins with the human body with which he was girded when he came to this earth. And it just, I don't know, I can see in just those two verses, this isn't Christ being anything different than he ever was. His whole life and mission on this earth was to come and save us, to cleanse
Sure.
us. And it's just a thimble-sized picture to me when I read this of Christ again, just living out and doing what he came to do.
Yeah, there are absolutely parallels between this act of service and the ultimate demonstration of service and sacrifice, and being willing to lay aside and be willing to go through sacrifice for the interest and sake and needs of someone else. So absolutely. All right, any other final comments before we kind of transition a tad? Yes, ma'am.
I think one of the things that I struggle with when serving is, like, is this, I don't know if the service is God's will or like what the recipient of the service, like if they're gonna take that and do something according to God's will or like not according to God's will. I don't know if I'm making sense.
You talking about giving a homeless man $5? That's
Yeah,
something.
like what is he gonna do with that $5?
Well, I don't know that this is the perfect scene for us to springboard to giving a homeless guy $5, because in the context, he is talking about serving each other, right? If we're just sticking to the context, wash one another's feet. I've given you an example, right? A new commandment I give you: love one another as I've loved you. Just a few verses down. I think it's another principle, and I think it goes back to the answer to that question, that we use some discretion. Okay. You remember years ago, homeless people used to have a sign that said, "We'll work for food"? Y'all remember that? I don't think that's a sign anymore. I don't think they even I don't even think they have the audacity to even write that on the sign anymore. We'll work for food. Well, if you ever went to the effort to say, "Hey, I need my yard cut, and I'll be willing to get you any kind of food you want if you'll come cut my yard," I mean, try that and see how much grass gets cut, right? The idea was that they are only after one thing: cash, right? Am I wrong? No, I mean, have you seen just how frequently bottles of water and pieces of fruit and sacks of fast food just lay there on the curb? Why? That's not what they want. I mean, that's not what they expect as they panhandle. Now, you can go to other portions of the city where they congregate and feed them. We've done that before. That's a different ministry, right? But I don't give cash I can think of a few occasions where I have, but I personally avoid giving people in that situation cash. And the reason is just like you say, I don't want to enable them. I don't want to give them $100 and they can get enough whatever drug of choice to overdose, because, I mean, that's just me. And again, I don't have a Bible verse that says, "Don't give cash to a homeless fella, thou shalt not." I'm just thinking this principle of enabling and some prudence and diligence. Now, if you want to give your cash in that regard, I can't say you've sinned in doing so. I just would say you might want to do some diligence about what they're going to do with that cash. Not that you're necessarily accountable for what they do with the cash. In other words, they could lie to you and say, "I have every good intention of going and getting me something to eat." Of course, I would say, well, you could go get them that something to eat and see if they ate it. Yes, done.
Years ago, I was rehabbing a Section 8 apartment complex, the worst state, the roughest neighborhood and everything.
Okay.
And the front apartment, one of the girls had been murdered with a shot with a machine gun.
Okay.
The other girl was on drugs, real heavy.
Okay.
Well, nobody could live there while I was fixing these up. And this girl came by one day, the one that had the addiction problem. She didn't beg for money. She wanted to come in
Okay, sure, yeah, I'm not saying that's never the case.
I couldn't let her because of our insurance.
All right.
But I took her across the street and bought her a meal. And I bought her a meal almost every day. And she ended up turning her life around. And
Great.
Because people helped her. And I got more criticism from the people that I was put in charge of because they actually worked for the construction company I was doing it. Well, why would you do that? They're scum. They're blah, 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 blah. So you're supposed to be Christians. What does the Bible teach us? What does Jesus teach us?
Yeah, absolutely. There are.
And they would, whenever, I mean, you got a lot of homeless people in that area. Whenever those people that would go by, these guys working for that company would harass them. And I wouldn't put up with it, and I sent one guy home one day because of it.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. That's unfortunate.
But my point was, and I told him, I said, listen, I'll give you time off to go across the street and buy one of those people a meal, and I'll pay for it. We're here to, it was accounted to everything, the way they were behaving.
Sure.
Everything on the spot.
Yeah. Okay, any other final comments, questions, thoughts about this before we move on? In the little bit of time we have, we'll introduce what we'll be talking about next. Yes, Nardio.
We can see from the scripture, we know that Jesus is so great and so powerful. But the beautiful thing about Jesus, he gives us so simple example that we can use those simple things and to make our life much better than ever. It's the opportunity for everybody. And serving one another, that is our calling as a Christian.
Absolutely. He certainly left us an example to follow. Now, if you recall, when we started this series of lessons several weeks ago, I mentioned to you that I had a rough outline for how we were going to be looking at the book of John. And one of the things I said was we were going to be looking at things like the 7 I am statements or the 7 miracles that are highlighted in John, and then some of these encounters. I also mentioned to you one of the things I wanted to do with the book of John were to note some doctrinal issues. And you say, well, isn't it all doctrine? Well, sure. But what I mean by that are certain passages that have led to certain doctrines. And there are several that surround John 1:1. Now, I mentioned them very briefly when we talked about John 1:1. In fact, the very first lesson in these series of lessons, we kind of unpacked John 1:1. I'd like to go back there now and note a couple of key, I guess is the word, key doctrinal issues. Look at John 1:1, and I think it's probably the one of the more, if not the most familiar, maybe setting apart John 3:16, it's one of the most familiar verses in John, which simply reads, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." Now, one of the doctrinal issues that is pervasive, and someone may come knock on your door and mention this to you, or if you press them on this, you can have a discussion about the nature of Jesus. And the Jehovah's Witnesses have a nature of Jesus that's obviously unscriptural, and most of which they put their understanding on a handful of verses, and this is a key one. In their translation, the New World Translation, which is from the Watchtower Press, and they have intentionally reworded some things to the benefit of their doctrine. For instance, if you have a New World Translation, it will read in this passage, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was a God." Now, the idea behind that is their understanding that Jesus, and this is the most noteworthy part of their false doctrine, is that Jesus was created. The idea that Jesus is not eternal, or that his equality with God in no way reflects that he is deity, but he was simply, as they'll point out, the firstborn. And the doctrine, as I understand it, gives us a basic timeline that God is eternal and that the first thing that God created was Jesus. And then Jesus, in this doctrine, created everything else. Now, the other biggest verse that they pin this understanding on is in Colossians chapter 1. Let's look at that together. Look at Colossians chapter 1 with me. Let's read a few verses. Now, we won't be able to unpack all the particulars of this view or the next view, which is the oneness Pentecostal view, or the Jesus-only movement. And we'll talk about that and this, and we'll have to really finish this up next week. So hopefully you can come back or tune in, watch it virtually or however to get the whole thing. But look at verse 15 of Colossians chapter 1. Speaking of Jesus, he is the image of the invisible God. It says the firstborn over all creation. And to the Jehovah Witness, their interpretation is, see there, he was born. And see there, he was created. He was the first one created. We accept that. But he was created. Not equal with God, not of the divine nature, not part of the Godhead, but he was created. Now, if we keep reading, it says, for by him, speaking again of Jesus, all things were created that are in heaven and that are on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created through him and for him. Well, if he's a created thing and he created all things, we have a dilemma, right? So here's this creating of all things requires that he is not created, even in the verses. But what are the verses trying to draw the attention of the audience to? The unique nature of Jesus and him being equal with God and the one that created everything. Same thing John's saying, in the beginning. What's he alluding to? Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God, Elohim, a plural. God created everything. And John, in his gospel, puts Jesus in equal footing to God the Creator. Now, if we go to Hebrews for just a moment, look at the book of Hebrews, and then we'll go back to John 1. Look at the book of Hebrews. Look at Hebrews chapter 1. Interestingly enough, we will probably caught by the bell for time's sake, but part of the doctrine of the Jehovah Witness is that Jesus is essentially an angel. In fact, often they'll say that Michael, the archangel, is just another name for Jesus. But what's interesting about it is Hebrews chapter 1 goes out of the way to say Jesus is no angel. To which angel did he ever say this? Or to which angel has ever been referred to as God? Or which angel ever received any type of worship? And in the context of that discussion, look at verse 2 and 3. Again, speaking of Jesus, it says, has in these last days spoken to us by his Son, whom he's appointed heir of all things, through whom also he made the worlds, who being the brightness of his glory and the express image of his person, the exact reproduction or the exact duplicate or the carbon copy or the image of the invisible God. Think about the Mount of Transfiguration where Jesus pulled back the one layer, if you will, of his humanity and showed his deity. Like we've already studied in the book of John. It's God taking on flesh and dwelling among us. Now, we'll drop down to verse 6. Look at verse 6, still in Hebrews chapter 1. Well, let's look at verse 5 first. He said, for to which of the angels did he ever say, you are my son, today I have begotten you? And again, I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. But when he had first when he again brings the firstborn into the world. There again is that term firstborn. Now you've studied your Old Testament, right? And you remember that the firstborn was a position within the family that was elevated. And he's using this same notion of firstborn, not to say that Jesus had a beginning in the sense that he was created, but that he was the firstborn. And this is not the only occasion. Several occasions use this notion of him being the firstborn of God or the only begotten of God. There are countless occasions where Jesus is referred to in his equality with God. Something we'll have to talk about a little bit more. And I want to encourage you. We just got the bell. But go back and read John 1 and verse 3 real quickly. Rod, you had a comment?
Could this be in regards to him, the freedom in the Godhead, that he was born here on this earth in the fleshly portion of his being?
Well, no, I don't think this term firstborn is used in that sense. However, we do know that he was born. I mean, Galatians 4 reminds us that in due time he was born of a virgin, and we know those particulars. But we've had the bell. Let's read verse 3. We'll come back and we'll talk more about this subject as much as we need to. It says in verse 3, all things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that was made. Again, this same argument. If he's created, why would he not be in this category of all things? He created all things, visible and invisible. What would you have to be to do that? All right, we'll have to pick up here and talk more about this subject from the viewpoint of the Jehovah's Witness and Oneness Pentecostals, who have a slightly different view. But again, it's a denying of the triune nature of God that we're addressing. All right, we'll have to pick up here next week. Appreciate your attention.